It's raining outside right now. Not very hard, but just enough to make you feel miserable. And so what better time for me to resume production of videos for discussion on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Today we're going to be talking about 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, a fan manga, which are better known as doujin, I think, in Japan. But I think here in North America, doujin specifically is a word reserved for like hentai and stuff. So I don't know if I should be using that term. The point is, this is a fan work that was sent to me by someone in the comments. And in order to finish, this Purple Haze arc of our own, right? Like, we've been talking about Purple Haze for so long, coming up on a year now, of course, with all the delays and stuff happening as well. And the Purple Haze feedback audiobook. In order to finish that entire chunk of my work, I thought it would be a good idea to wrap it up with the introduction of a new series called FANalyzing. Not really sure how to pronounce that, but FANalyzing will be focusing on fan works and fan art and stuff like that of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and seeing, like what patterns come up in those and how we can study them and what we can get out of them. So I'm really excited to work on this series, and I'm going to start with this work right here called 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde. I hope you guys are excited as well, and I hope you guys enjoy. I should probably start by noting that the manga itself will be used as footage in the background, but unfortunately it hasn't been typeset, so it has been translated on Gelboru, which I'll link to in the description below. So if you want to read the manga yourself, then you can go to the website and click through the image set for yourself, and there'll be translations that you can mouse over. But the pictures themselves will be the raw, so if you don't know Japanese, then some things might not make a lot of sense immediately, but at least they'll be cool to look at. So the whole point of FANalyzing is that instead of looking at all of these fan arts and fan works as texts in the JoJo universe, I'll be looking at them as fan work. So people who really like JoJo, what do they share with one another, and what do they like to put into the creations of JoJo that they make as fans, rather than as official authors of, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure novel, or, the people developing the video game. That's from a very official standpoint. But as fans, they have the unique freedom of reinterpreting the elements of JoJo in a way that they deem appropriate. So instead of placing a lot of focus on character interactions or how well a character is written, stuff like that, that talks about the quality of the text, it will be a lot of comparisons between JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and the text itself, and what remains from the original in this reimagination. What elements of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are best represented in the work that we'll be studying. So 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde is actually a very appropriate text to introduce the idea of FANalyzing to you guys, because as a fan work, it does so many interesting things in terms of both stealing from Araki and also paying respect to him, and also introducing some of the author's original voice. And I'll break down what each of those things meant over the course of the video. But we'll start with copying Araki, right? Because it's really obvious when you look at 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde that the art style is entirely inspired by Araki's art style, from Vento Oreo at the very least. And I can throw up some comparison drawings to see the similarities and differences, but in the way that the faces are drawn, feels like it's being injected with the personality of the original characters and also of Araki himself, as though he were the one drawing these instead of some fan artist. I'm not going to talk about the quality of the art itself. I do think it suffers every once in a while. I'm not sure whether that's just because the artist isn't particularly good, or because they're unfamiliar with Araki's style. But instead, I wanted to talk about why an artist would feel the need to copy Araki's style. And I think of all the things in fan art, I think this is the one most consistent thing. And I'll talk about that more later over like future FANalyzing videos, surely. Because it's such a consistent thing that comes up over a bunch of different fan art. But I think that a lot of people like to copy Araki's art style when they're doing JoJo's Bizarre Adventure stuff, because they recognize that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is almost entirely Araki's vision. There's no part of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure that doesn't feel like Araki has put himself, the things he likes and the things that he finds interested in and his own personality into. And so to find JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as an inspiration is to find Araki himself as an inspiration. I think this is how people approach it. And I'm sure, if you guys have ever tried writing anything JoJo's Bizarre Adventure related, or drawing a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure character, you felt the same way, that if you're trying to evoke JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, right? The feeling that you're watching or reading or interacting with anything JoJo related, then it has to be Araki-esque for it to feel real. I think that's the reason why the anime and the video games put so much effort into making the characters look like the manga designs, even as the manga designs change over time. I think that's the reason why the Purple Haze feedback author tried introducing all of these bizarre similes, like he had jet engines in his legs. Just weird stuff like this. It's all in an effort to replicate Araki's weirdness and oddness, dare I say bizarreness, and to celebrate Araki in a way by creating JoJo's Bizarre Adventure content that mimics his art style and his writing. And in fact, 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde doesn't just copy, or rather, I shouldn't say copy, because I don't think they're really doing that. I really like the word evoke when it comes to this. Obviously, they're not like tracing Araki's art style. Instead, they're making you feel like you're reading the original text. Calling it evoking JoJo's Bizarre Adventure sounds both really cool and also gets the point across very well. 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde evokes JoJo's Bizarre Adventure not just through the artistry but also through the writing, I think. Like especially this moment right here, Fugo starts talking about the song This Is the Moment. Firstly, it's a song. So again, the audio reference, that's the kind of thing that Araki would have a lot of in his texts. But also, just like this random trivia about how This Is the Moment is an Olympic song that people really liked, but originally it was written for a musical about Jekyll and Hyde. This is the kind of odd segue that would get you from point A to point B on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And here specifically, it ties the two texts together, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and Jekyll and Hyde, which we'll talk about very shortly. Also, there's a reference to the fall off your horse moment from Steel Ball Run, I think. She does say, "Eat shit, hassle," according to the translation. I don't know if that's equivalent in Japanese, but when you read "eat shit, asshole," obviously the next line has to be, "fall off your horse." Anyway, so yeah, like immediately 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde proves a point that I've been thinking about for a long time, and that's that fan art of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is more than just fan art. It's an evocation. It's like a prayer. It's like a prayer to a great god Araki and our holy book JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's like singing a hymn, like to reproduce Araki's art style, to reproduce the way he writes. For JoJo fans is something almost special and something that they can use to invoke the Araki within themselves. And I can't speak for everyone who does JoJo fan art, and I can't even speak for the authors of 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde. Maybe they did, in fact, use Araki's Part 5 style just because they wanted people to get in the mood of Part 5, right? Like they wanted people to be immersed in the idea that this is a Part 5 backstory. But I don't think that's the case, because I really see a lot of artwork that tries to emulate Araki's art style. Just the sheer volume of it is evidence enough, in my opinion, for this to be a legitimate point of interest. So let's move on to the actual themes of 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde and where the story is coming from and how it's constructed as a fan work. So interestingly, instead of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the Fugo of 5 Meters in Jekyll and Hyde is actually from Purple Haze feedback. They share the same backstory, right down to beating the prof over the head with a dictionary, going to university as a kid and being really disillusioned with everyone there and just like not really caring. That's all part of Jekyll and Hyde. So I think this is another good reason why we can kind of bookend the entire Purple Haze feedback stuff that we've done before with 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde. While Purple Haze feedback was an ending to Part 5, 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde is actually set before the events of Part 5, before Giorno joined, before the gang even knew that Pashone was selling drugs. And this actually tries to fill in some of those gaps, right? Like how exactly did Fugo and Abakio recognize that Pashone was selling gangs? And this is one of the events that leads us there. Back when we were talking about Purple Haze feedback, I was talking about how the best parts of that book were the parts that reflected the past of Bruno's gang before they were embroiled in the fight against Diavolo, how they just lived as mobsters and what they thought of life and how they acted as a group. And so it's really interesting that the fan work also does the same thing. And in fact, there's no framing narrative set in the present to bog that down at all. It's all purely Fugo and Abakio's actions to take down this rival gang, or so they believe, who are selling drugs in their territory. All while digging deeper into Fugo's backstory, which remains still pretty lackluster after Purple Haze feedback. So all the good things about Purple Haze feedback that I've enjoyed as a fan are being revisited in 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, a fan work. So What does that say? There's the rub. What exactly can we decode about the JoJo's fandom from this small revelation? I think it's that we really enjoy digging into the backstories of certain things, because Araki leaves so much, and Araki himself has mentioned this. I don't know if I can find the interview where he mentions this. If I do, then I'll certainly post it on the video. But he himself has said that he enjoys leaving out details so that people can fill it in themselves. The fact that not only FANworks but an official text has tried to embrace that and actually give depth to characters that were written out of the original work really makes that evident, I think. That we're willing to engage with the leftovers of Araki's writing certainly merits both our dedication as a fandom, certainly, but also how free the JoJo universe is, how easy it is to improvise within it, and how certain things just make sense even if we don't really pay a lot of attention to it. So certainly the merit also goes to Araki as someone who can leave out details but still keep us invested in those details, that we want to fill in what isn't there by ourselves. I think something that would be really, really interesting is if the JoJo fandom actually got together and built something by themselves, a story or a video game or something unique. Like the 7th Stand User is kind of what I'm talking about, but also something with a bit more narrative depth, and not just like, hey, here's Stardust Crusaders, but you're in it now. Shizuka Joestar, you know, the whole fascination with Shizuka Joestar and how people have created so many different versions of her with different stands and different, well, I shouldn't say abilities, but different designs at the very least, and how they've evolved the original power is what I was trying to say. There you go. How they've evolved that original power of a baby being invisible and they've extended it to different ways. That, I think, is exactly the kind of detailing that I'm talking about here, that the JoJo fandom absolutely loves. It would be great to have a Shizuka Joestar text from Araki, but I think this is one of those things that makes me, and makes no doubt a lot of people in the fandom, appreciate JoJo's Bizarre Adventure more. That there is someone that the entire fandom loves and that we can center around and we can build something out of, and Araki won't even touch it because that's just not who he is. Shizuka Joestar is effectively our character, like a JoJo fandom mascot. So I guess I am kind of going off track here, but at the same time, the reason why I think JoJo fandom works so much is because we like to evoke so much of Araki's work, while at the same time focusing on stuff that he hasn't done. In a way, we're like trying to fill in the jigsaw puzzle that Araki has left incomplete. With part 7, he completely ended the first universe that still has a bunch of stuff that we could work out. Like, you know, the relationship between Dio and all his other, you know, stand-using friends. Could we add more to that? And certainly Over Heaven has. When I get to making my audiobook of that, you'll be getting a lot more of that, and it will be a lot more evident what even official texts like to do in terms of filling in these details that have been left behind. So I feel like, you know, like I said before, 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde is such a good text to start this fan analysis stuff, because it does all of these very blatantly. There's no pretense about it. It goes ham. It goes totally ham, both in stealing Araki's work and paying attention to all these little details that have been missed out in Purple Haze feedback and in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So it's just sitting on top of all of these layers of what other authors have added to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, what Araki himself has refused to add to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, like those little details that I've been talking about. One example of this in 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde is like the absurdity of seeing Moody Blues turning into the driver of a car. But there's no car, so it's literally just a guy floating around in space pretending to drive a car. That's not the kind of thing that we've ever seen before, and yet because it's a fan work, because the artists and the authors of 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde have had so much time and have had so much information to sit on top of and think and be creative, that's what distinguishes fan work from something that has actually been professionally produced by either Araki or one of these novel writers that I've been talking about. And also the ability to tie in Jekyll and Hyde's ego versus id thing into Fugo and his stand and his rage and all of these different facets of his personality that we saw in Purple Haze feedback. All of this pays gratitude to both the depth that we saw in Purple Haze feedback and the nature of stands that we see from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And yet when it becomes this evident, and when you introduce something as interesting as a textual study of Jekyll and Hyde in a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fan work, then you start seeing something really interesting. And that's what's so charming and interesting about JoJo's fandom creations. That we're willing to respect Araki, that we're willing to steal from Araki, that we're willing to introduce external text and remix it with content from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, that we're willing to fill in the details that we care about as opposed to retreading ground that Araki has already pursued in the various parts of JoJo. So now that we've touched on it, let's briefly talk about the thematic reading of 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde. This text does a lot, in my opinion, to help us understand stands in a simple but bold new light. Stands, we've always appreciated that stands are a reflection of the user's personality, but it's never really made obvious in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure that stands don't really have to be that way. That stands can sometimes be a mix of the user's commands and the user's immediate desires, but also an underlying instinct or a sense of, justice, sense of self or purpose or the user's nature. And sometimes that can manifest in a really ugly way. It doesn't have to. With Josuke, for example, Josuke is a really well-meaning person at heart. You see Crazy Diamond and it's got like all of these hearts. It's bright pink and blue, for crying out loud. Like, it's a really happy and non-aggressive stand that heals people. That's what it ostensibly is. But then you look at the details, like its really aggressive looking helmet, spikes all over, and how muscular it is, how strong it is. And you realize that some of those facets are directly reliant on Josuke's anger, right? Like how quick to anger he is, how furious he can get if someone does something bad to his friends or his family, or for whatever silly reason decides to insult his hair. Crazy Diamond represents both facets of Josuke, even though one is very prominent, the other one is represented in a more subtle way that becomes more apparent when you place a lot of focus on it, like I just did by pointing it out. The opposite would be what 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde is proposing about Fugo's stand, Purple Haze, and that's that much like how Fugo is ostensibly representing reason and logic and calm, rational thought, his stand, Purple Haze, is the manifestation of all of his anger and rage, which we've already talked about with Purple Haze feedback. It's all of his destructive tendencies focused into a single power, that of the virus. Much like how, at a very simple glance, Jekyll from Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Jekyll, is the manifestation of reason and logic and rational thought. After all, he's a scientist, right? Like, he's meant to be someone who advocates for the progress of humanity's enlightenment. Or, that's like the trope of all scientists in every horror book ever. I took a course in horror literature last semester, and the number of scientists that are just there fucking around with technology and totally screwing up the world for everyone else because they've unleashed some terrible horror on unsuspecting victims is far too high. And in this case, Dr. Jekyll does unleash a monster that is Hyde. And Hyde, ostensibly, is meant to be a manifestation of all that is impulsive, lacking forethought, or reason, or logic, or all of these good traits that we previously attributed to the Doctor. But as 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde discusses, that's not the case. Jekyll isn't some great representation of reason and of rational thought. Instead, he's just a flawed human that wants to put his flaws somewhere else. Right? Like, he wants to engage in all of these impulses. And in order to engage with them, he creates Hyde. Which is the physical manifestation of all of those negative energies that he has, which sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's exactly what Purple Haze was to Fugo. But unlike this very simple tale of Jekyll and Hyde, of the ego versus the id, of suppressing your desire and then letting it explode and losing all control, which is of course something else that happens in 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, or Fugo tries to let it happen, but then it doesn't. Unlike that simple duality, instead the Jekyll and the Hyde of 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, kind of starting to feel like a very long and redundant title, isn't it? The Jekyll and the Hyde of this text is within Fugo himself, but he has a motivation to restrict his Hyde. He does not want to let it out because of Purple Haze, because he lets it out and everyone dies, including himself. And so this is the part that I really wanted to get to, this understanding of stands that is simple yet bold. Because the author of this text has looked at the nature of stands and has decided that more than just a power that reflects your mentality, a stand should also be a key focus of the conflict that drives that character, that makes that character interesting. And it's a really efficient vehicle of bringing across what is important to that character, their personal flaws, their desires, and the limitations to, shall we call it, their resolve, how far they're willing to go in order to get what they want. Unfortunately, I think that the only character they do this with is with Fugo. Now, for a 20-page chapter, essentially, it's not like they have all the time in the world to explore all of the characters that are in there. And they briefly do go over some of the other stands. Like, I think the one they did for Naranjo was really interesting. Like, oh, he almost lost his eyesight, and now he has the ability to see, using his radar, how people breathe and stuff like that. And also, they briefly talk about Abakio and how he's playing his memories back to himself because he's reliving his trauma. But I think, especially with Fugo, they really go so deep in terms of exploring personal conflict through the stand that it really deserves merit. This is one of the reasons why 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde does something much better than a lot of other fan work does, because it brings new ideas to the table. Now, I'm not saying that the JoJo fandom is completely bereft of new ideas, that they can't introduce anything novel at all, but I do think we kind of tend to cycle back on the same ideas over and over again. And 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, by bringing in the metaphor of Jekyll and Hyde, tries to decode a stand user's relationship with their stand as a conflict between ego and id, and much more than that as well. Looking forward, that's something that I would really like to see in future fan works. Kind of this understanding, this embrace-al. Is that a word? It's not a word, I just looked it up, and the word I was looking for was embracement. If fans could embrace this idea that stands don't have to be a direct extension of the character, but can represent much, much more than that. Oh, that would be... I think that would be like the golden age of JoJo fandom and JoJo fan works. I mean, like, talk about evoking Araki. I think that having this kind of depth to stands would be exactly the proper way to do that. I mean, I've got a video, I feel like I keep shilling this video out. About half a year ago, I did a video talking about character development in stand fights, and I've really tried to show the level of depth that Araki puts into these stand powers and these stand designs. And why it's so fascinating to talk about stands as though they're more than just a facet of a character. And so if fan works can embrace that and really expand upon that idea and bring new understandings to it and help us decode what exactly a stand can be, I think that would be super, super cool. And that's not to say I haven't seen fan works that haven't done it. Of course, 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde has done it, but there has been others, and I'm willing to share those with you guys through future FANalyzing videos. But for now, I think I've talked in circles enough that you've gotten the gist of my opinions of this particular fan work, 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde. I hope you guys enjoyed the video as long as it was. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, because I'd really be interested what you think of FANalyzing in general, what you thought of 5 Meters of Jekyll and Hyde, what you thought of this video as well and the ideas that I'm bringing up. And also, if you've got anything interesting that you think the fandom has made, or that you personally have made that is easy to share, and that I can make a video about, then put that in the comments and I'd be sure to give it a read. My throat is dying, so I'm just going to end the video here. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.